What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and welcome to another Datasheet Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be diving into the Vindicator datasheet. Now, the Chaos Space Marine Codex released recently, and Vindicators have been getting a ton of focus in that codex, with a lot of really powerful combos and detachments available. So while I believe this is the first Datasheet Deep Dive where we've discussed a datasheet that is available in multiple factions, I will be focusing this video primarily on discussing the Chaos Space Marine Vindicators and the combos available to them. I will still touch on Loyalist Space Marine Vindicators momentarily, but that is not going to be the main focus of the video. So let's jump into this datasheet and talk about the strengths and weaknesses of the Vindicator. Now, these things are enormous, heavily armored siege tanks. They come in at a high toughness value of 11 alongside an excellent armor save of 2+. They also have an awkward number of wounds, 11 wounds, and while they can be damaged, that 11 wounds makes them awkward to kill for even damage weapons. That is counteracted, however, by their slow speed. Unlike most vehicles that come in at 10+ inch movement, Vindicators only rock in at a 9-inch movement. And because they are vehicle keyworded, that means they can't go through terrain like ruins, meaning that they get stopped up quite a bit by terrain. While they are resilient enough to, in many cases, plow up the table and walk into line of sight without worry about getting killed too trivially, if they are trying to maneuver around terrain features, their threat range can actually get incredibly short. And that is the biggest weakness of the chassis, since their main weapon is their Demolisher Cannon. These big guns are a 24-inch range weapon that fires D6 plus 3 shots at a ridiculous profile, strength 14 AP3 for D6 damage. This is an interesting combination of effects, because the Demolisher Cannon itself fires a pretty high volume of attacks. D6 plus 3 averages 6.3 attacks with that incredible profile, but they are also high value attacks. The profile you would expect from a heavy anti-tank weapon. Something like a las cannon is not far off from the blasting attacks from these Demolisher Cannons, which puts them at kind of a crossroads, with both being relatively high volume, but also high impact and high value. Not a combination that you see on many weapons. Obviously, it is counteracted by their short range at only 24 inches, but it does have the blast keyword, which not only means that in some instances it gets the penalty of not being able to fire into melee, but it does mean that that volume can be enhanced even farther, and makes Vindicators incredibly dangerous against heavy infantry units. Units with multi-wound infantry that have 2, 3, or 4 wounds apiece are going to get vaporized by these things, because not only are they triggering blast, but that D6 damage and high AP is going to work to their benefit. Now, they also have some additional weapons mounting on top. The Loyalist versions come mounted with Hunter-Killer missiles, and the Chaos versions can mount a Havoc Launcher for some additional anti-infantry shooting, alongside a Storm Bolter, but these aren't quite as relevant when discussing the powers of the Vindicator. Mostly, we're going to be looking at how much damage we can get out of that Demolisher Cannon. Now, that cannon also has an additional benefit, which is the Siege Shield ability. This allows the Vindicator to make ranged attacks when targeting enemy units within engagement range of it. While vehicles can already do this thanks to Big Guns Never Tire, the downside is that blast weapons normally cannot be fired into units that are engagement range of your own models, even if it is the model with the blast weapon itself. The risk of hitting yourself or your friendlies with the blast attack is too great, and they won't take the shot. However, the Siege Shield protects the Vindicator, and the blast from the weapon would just end up bouncing off of that protective barrier. There are some idiosyncrasies with this ability, however, and some restrictions on it. First of all, it can only target enemy units in engagement range of itself if they are not engaging any other friendly units. So, for example, an infantry unit that is engaging a Vindicator but strung out to touch another vehicle or another unit in your army prevents the Vindicator from being able to fire. I guess it would be worried about hitting the other unit that its target is engaged with instead. While it doesn't suffer the penalty to its hit rolls for being within engagement range, and it's important to note that this is always the case, so even when engaged and firing out of engagement, it won't get that penalty, which is a very big buff. It has no other way to get around the restrictions of the blast keyword. So while it can essentially ignore that blast keyword when firing at units only engaging itself, it still has no ability to fire into melee of units that are engaging others. So, for example, an enemy vehicle engaging multiple friendly units would still be untargetable by the Demolisher Cannon, because that blast keyword would prevent you from shooting into combat. Now, generally speaking, the strong defensive characteristics of the Vindicator make it an excellent combination with any survivability enhancements. Effects like Armor of Contempt to reduce incoming AP on an already 2+ save model is huge, and Smokescreen to grant stealth and potential for some cover even while out in the open also can protect these guys quite a bit. That 2+ save makes any additional save increasing effect even more powerful, and you can combo those with other effects that reduce incoming damage, for example, to make these things truly difficult to kill. On top of that, they can also be an offensive powerhouse. Anything that increases their threat range is huge because their threat range is already relatively short, so granting them assault or increased movement is always going to be very good, but also because their weapon is both firing a reasonable volume of attacks and those attacks are enormously impactful. Gaining rerolls or sustained hits are enormous. Comboing these effects together alongside enhanced critical hits is huge and is a big factor in most of the important combos that Chaos Vindicators are taken alongside and the ones I'll be discussing today. Now let's move on from there to talk about Loyalist Vindicators coming out of the Space Marine Codex. The biggest difference between Space Marine Vindicators and Chaos Space Marine Vindicators, in addition to the detachments and combos available to them, is going to be their faction ability. Chaos Vindicators gain Dark Pacts, which allow them to gain lethal or sustained hits built in, whereas Loyalist Vindicators have Oaths of Moment, which allow them to get rerolls to hit built in, but they have to source their critical effects from somewhere else. The Space Marine Codex has a lot of really powerful synergies with the Vindicator. They have a lot of ways to improve their threat range. Detachments like Gladius Task Force can use Devastator Doctrine to allow them to advance and shoot, and the Firestorm Assault Force grants all their ranged weapons assault naturally, making these natural fits for the Vindicator. Additionally, Ironstorm Spearhead is basically the home away from home for these guys because of all of its combos with vehicles, and especially big heavy vehicles like the Vindicator. Master of Machine War gives them the ability to advance and shoot, and can combine with enhanced critical effects like sustained hits from Mercy's Weakness, alongside lethal hits from Target Augury Web, and that aforementioned Oath of Moment to reroll its hit rolls to try to gain those enhanced critical hits for some truly staggering damage. Now this combination is available both in Space Marines and in Chaos Space Marines, and I'll be talking about it in a sec, but before that, let's just talk about some math for how much damage we can expect from the Vindicator. So, assuming we're firing at an enemy that does not have a high model count, and so won't be blasted against, the D6 plus 3 shots from the Demolisher Cannon averages somewhere around 6.5. The average result of 1d6 comes between 3 and 4, so you're looking at around 3.5. Although obviously this can spike up, and especially if you are willing to spend command points to reroll your number of attacks, you can gain significantly more shots out of these guys. Now the average number of 5-up critical hits, if you are gaining an enhanced critical effect, on 6.5 shots is about 2.17. If you are then re-rolling your attacks, you're averaging somewhere around 3.6. This also gets you after the re-rolls for the 5-ups, and assuming you have no other effects in place, you can get bonuses to hit on these guys from Tech Marines, for example. You're averaging another 1.4 regular hits for a total of 5 wound rolls. These come from the 3.6 additional hits we get from sustained hits, plus the 1.4 regular hits that we've rolled normally. On top of that, you're also getting 3.6 auto wounds from the lethal hits, in this case granted by Target Augury Web. This averages 6.9, a very nice result. Converted wounds that are passed on to the armor save, which against a 3+ armor save that gets reduced to a 6+ thanks to the AP3 of the Demolisher Cannon, assuming it has no other buffs active. And there are several ways to gain these guys ignore cover or +1 AP to get through that armor save. Around 13 damage, assuming that we are wounding on 3s, which they will wound basically the entire game on either 2s or 3s at that high strength of 14, giving this combination the ability to one-shot essentially any other medium weight battle tank in the game. Any of these toughness 10 to 12 3+ save battle tanks, things like gladiators, should get one-tapped by this Vindicator combo. And that's not including the additional shots that could potentially be coming from its top guns, hunter killer missiles, or in the case of Chaos Space Marines, havoc launchers that could potentially additionally chip in some damage, especially if you have other offensive benefits applied to the Vindicator. Again, this gets buffed when supported by characters. Models like the Tech Marine can give them +1 to hit, or in Chaos Space Marines, the Warpsmith, which we will talk about now, because we're going to talk about some combos within the Chaos Space Marine Codex. Now, the Warpsmith is the obvious one. These guys can heal vehicles and grant +1 to hit for vehicles, and in armies that are revolving around the heavy usage of vehicles, Warpsmiths are probably going to be hanging around somewhere. The other big part of the combination is Abaddon the Despoiler. While there are other ways to gain hit rerolls in the Chaos faction, Abaddon is the easiest one. He can choose in your command phase one War Master ability, one of them being the Paragon of Hatred, which gives you hit rerolls on your Heretic Astartes units within 6 inches of him. That allows Abaddon to centrally locate himself around a brick of Vindicators or other similar heavy vehicles and grant them all the rerolls in order to convert those critical hit effects. You can use Dark Pact to then turn on those critical hits, and you can combine that with a Hellbrute. Hellbrutes are the Chaos Space Marine equivalent of the smaller Dreadnought variants from the Space Marine Codex, and they have the Dark Ascension aura, which grants Heretic Astartes units within 6 inches both lethal and sustained hits when pledging for a Dark Pact. Between these two units, this basically allows you to turn on most of the Ironstorm Spearhead combination that we just talked about, meaning that you have that super high reliability, super high impact shooting available to you in essentially any detachment, but some detachments can grant enhanced versions of them. On top of that, we can also look at some other units, things like the Terminator Sorcerer to grant additional AP with Death Hex that can further buff these attacks outside of any detachment abilities. But now, let's talk about detachment abilities specifically. And I'm going to start from the top this time and talk about Pact-Bound Zealots, because this is the most common place that we have seen Chaos Vindicators played in the past. Pact-Bound Zealots allows you to pledge to a specific Chaos God to grant 5 up criticals in certain situations, typically when pledging for one of the lethal hits or sustained in either melee or shooting, depending on the specific god. In this case, Chaos Vindicators tend to pledge to Nurgle. That gains them 5+ critical hits when Dark Pacting for sustained hits, which will then, if they are within 6 inches of a Hellbrute, trigger both lethal and sustained, the full combination that we discussed previously. So if they are pacted to Nurgle, performing a Dark Pact within 6 inches of a Hellbrute and within 6 inches of Abaddon, they have that 13 damage available to them without the use of any stratagems, meaning that all 3 Vindicators that are potentially in this list could be delivering that insane damage. Nurgle also gives you access to the Festering Miasma stratagem, making it hard to shoot back into them and giving you potential multiple instances of stealth on multiple Vindicators between Smokescreen and their Festering Miasma. And they can also heal wounds back using Skin Shift. On top of that, Undivided Vindicators can get wound rerolls from Profane Zeal, although obviously they will not be getting their enhanced criticals if they have chosen to gain the Undivided keyword. Now on top of that, there are a lot of other detachments that have huge bonuses for big heavy vehicles like the Vindicator in the Chaos Space Marine Codex. The first one being the Soulforged Warpack. This detachment has a ton of bonuses for vehicles and especially demonic vehicles. For example, you can use Forge's Blessing, the enhancement, to gain a Feel No Pain on the Vindicators, which can further buff their survivability. You can use Unstoppable Rampage to extend their threat range by moving through terrain, and Demonic Possession will turn the Vindicator into a demon. This unlocks the enhanced pacts granted by the detachment ability, potential for additional AP, hit rerolls from Tempting Addendum, and additional strength if you really needed to from Vashtor standing nearby. Given how many Warpsmiths Soulforged Warpack tends to take, and the fact that these guys love to get hit rerolls and +1 to hit from Warpsmiths, makes these a natural combination for Soulforged packs if you have additional space in the list after taking all of your regular demon engines. Now, last but certainly not least for the real powerhouse detachments in this codex is Renegade Raiders. This is the most commonly played detachment in the Chaos Space Marine Codex right now, and while it has less direct synergy than detachments like Soulforged Warpack or Pact-Bound Zealots, it does have a lot of passive bonuses that are hugely impactful for Vindicators. First of all, additional AP when shooting at targets on objectives is just a big deal. Most of the time, that puts you to a high enough AP to punch cleanly through your opponent's armor save, or at the very least, counteract cover if they are benefiting from it. On top of that, you can also gain access to an Armor of Contempt-like effect from stratagems, and even fall back at the end of your opponent's fight phase. While they don't have the ability to fall back and operate normally in the detachment, that allows you to pull out of combat and then operate normally on the next turn, which can counteract much of the counterplay to their Siege Shield not being able to fire in certain circumstances. Last and certainly not least, they also gain Assault on their ranged weapons from the detachment ability. That's a big deal, because again, anything that increases the threat range of these guys is huge. Now moving on to some other detachments, there are a few other synergies that we can find in here. In the Fellhammer Siege Force, you can use Warp Tracer to remove cover from enemies to make their gunshots a little bit more effective. You can gain Feel No Pain and charge reductions from stratagems, and even use Pitiless Cannonade to gain enhanced criticals to turn on the entire combination that we talked about earlier. This is also the detachment that focuses primarily on survivability, so having high toughness, high saving throw models like Vindicators just taking up the midboard is generically going to be good for it. Veterans of the Long War gets you hit rerolls from its Hatred mechanic, alongside an Armor of Contempt effect. These guys basically operate like Loyalist Vindicators in this detachment, although they don't have access to things like Ironstorm Spearhead, which would put them at full power. And Deceptors allows you to fall back and shoot, which again can circumvent some of the downsides of that Siege Shield. Now, speaking of those downsides, let's talk about dealing with Vindicators. The first piece of technology that you can use against these things is simply not letting them shoot you. As I've mentioned many times before, skirting their threat range and line of sight is not the hardest thing in the world. Because their cannons don't reach super far, their movement isn't particularly long, and they are oftentimes blocked by terrain, meaning that it's very predictable. Outside of the detachments or situations where you are gaining assault from detachment abilities or other effects, you basically know exactly where the Chaos Vindicators are going to be going and can simply not put yourself there. While a 9-inch move plus a 24-inch range will reach most of the way across the table, it means that in the early game you can set yourself up out of their range to prevent them from being able to shoot you, or set yourself up behind terrain in positions where your opponent won't have the maneuverability to skirt line of sight to get onto you. Now that said, this is not a perfect solution, since generally speaking you're going to have to break cover at some point to be able to move into the Vindicators. Chaos Space Marine player is not incentivized highly to move them very aggressively out in the open until they've been engaged. That said, once you do engage them, you can use the downsides of that Siege Shield ability to prevent them from firing if your opponent doesn't have any way to fall back and attack with them. Locking a single Vindicator into melee doesn't prevent you from being shot by that one Vindicator, but it does mean that any other Vindicators or other blast weapons that the Chaos player might have are not going to be able to target you, so you are taking less damage than you normally would. However, the real dream is to lock multiple Vindicators into melee. If you have multiple Vindicators engaged, none of them are going to be able to attack you, which then forces them to fall back and potentially blanks their shooting for that turn. Obviously, things go differently if the Vindicators have the ability to fall back and shoot, but not all detachments have access to them, and some of the most powerful ones, for example, the Pact-Bound Zealots, have no way to allow their units to fall back and operate normally. Last but certainly not least is simply just taking hefty anti-armor shooting. These guys are very difficult to kill, but they aren't protected by anything more than having a solid profile full of stats, and so while they are often able to save out of even heavier anti-tank shooting, especially once combined with cover or armor of contempt effects, having super high AP values and really high impact weapons is a good way to get around their profile. Anti-tank weapons of the weight of las cannons or higher will be able to punch through their high toughness value because they're not quite as heavily armored as something like a Land Raider, and if you can source devastating wounds, cover ignoring, or additional AP effects on those weapons to punch through their high armor save, they do go down fairly quickly. The one thing you have to keep in mind is when you're playing against the Vindicators in a detachment like Pact-Bound Zealots and not getting caught out by festering miasma to make them unshootable. And with that, that's all we have to talk about in terms of Vindicators. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video, and let me know down in the comment section what you think about the resurgence of these old tanks. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.